Hello, folks, and welcome back to the Digestive System. This is lecture 1B, so the second lecture of the Digestive System. And we're going to start off with the peritoneum. Peritoneum. So if you remember back when we first started back in like August and September, remember we had the pericardium, which was the serous membranes that surround the heart. We have the pleural membranes that surround the lungs. And we also have the peritoneum, which is the serous membranes which surround and protect the abdominal organs. So here you can see the entire abdominal cavity, starting up here at the diaphragm, and then moving on to like the liver, there's the stomach, you have the small intestines, starting with the duodenum, the jejunum, ileum, and then all the way down here, you have different parts of the large intestines, like the ileum and the sigmoid colon. So this peritoneum is the serous membrane that surrounds and protects the abdominal cavities. And remember, there's 3 layers. So out here on the very outside, the most superficial, closest to the skin, is going to be the parietal peritoneum. In between, so this black right here, now the space is not actually as big as you see it here, but that space is called the peritoneal cavity or the peritoneal space. And then the layer of the peritoneum that's directly adhered to the abdominal organs is going to be the visceral peritoneum, the visceral layer. And you can see that right here. That's just directly adhered to all these organs. So here it is right here, directly surrounding the stomach. So that would be the visceral peritoneum. And it's all interconnected. So here you can see it right here, directly adhered to the duodenum, the first part of the small intestines. And you can see it down here, which is surrounding and protecting that's the jejunum, the second part of the small intestine. And then finally, down here, protecting the last part of the small intestines, called the ileum. Now remember, the function of this is that the space, the peritoneal cavity, contains a serous fluid, which is very slippery. So it allows these organs, these structures in the digestive system, to move around without causing friction. So they're not rubbing against each other. So that slippery serous fluid allows them to kind of glide past each other without sticking. Now, just posterior or behind the peritoneum is called the retroperitoneal space, or it's also called just the retroperitoneum. So this is the space posterior or behind the peritoneum. So if you removed all the abdominal organs like the stomach and the liver and you saw what's behind it, that space back there is the retroperitoneum or the retroperitoneal space. And some important structures that are contained in that are the most important ones that you'll probably be tested on would be like the kidneys, maybe the aorta and inferior vena cava. So the aorta is the largest artery in the body, and the inferior vena cava would be the largest vein. And also parts of the small intestine, the duodenum, is located behind the peritoneum in the retroperitoneal space. And also the ascending and descending colon. So the part of the large intestine, the ascending, is what goes up from the cecum, goes up, and then it goes to the transverse colon, and then remember it goes back down. That'll be the descending colon. So these are important structures that are located in the retroperitoneal space. All right, so now different parts of the peritoneum. So all these structures, these are extensions of the peritoneum. So all these together make up the peritoneum. So the first one is the greater omentum. Maybe you remember that from back in August or September. That's the fatty apron, which drapes over the transverse colon, that part of the large intestine that runs transverse or horizontally. So it goes from the ascending colon, which is coming up, and then it goes transverse, which will move from right to left through the body. So that's the greater omentum is what hangs over the transverse colon and then covers the small intestines. That's why they call it the fatty apron. It contains lymph nodes, part of the lymphatic system, which releases white blood cells called macrophages, and those are special cells that fight infections like bacterial or viral particles. Now you have the lesser omentum, which we don't go over quite as much. And that is the part of the peritoneum that is between the liver and the stomach. So it anchors the liver and the stomach together. You have the mesentery, and that's the fatty layer, part of the peritoneum, which binds and holds the small intestines together. And then you have the mesocolon, which is the part of the peritoneum which holds the large intestines in place. And here you can see the location of some of these structures. So right here, this would be the greater omentum. All this right here, the fatty apron, which drapes down, covering the transverse colon. Here's the transverse colon right here. So in this, the greater omentum has been like lifted up. So here it is up here. It's been kind of lifted up so you can see what's behind it. So the greater omentum would drape down like this over here. So, but when lifted up, you can see right here, all this tissue right here is holding the large intestine in place, and that's the mesocolon. Because here, right here, this is the large intestine right there. And right over here, you can see this is the small intestines right here. And this tissue right here, that's the mesentery, which is helping to bind together and hold in place the small intestines. And the last one, the one we talked the least about, is the lesser omentum. So you can see the liver here, the stomach here, and in between, binding the liver and the stomach together is right here. That is the lesser omentum. So once again, so remember, binding the small intestines, that would be the mesentery. Binding the large intestines, that would be the mesocolon. And the fatty apron, which drapes down over the transverse colon up here and hangs down over the small intestines, that is the greater omentum. Peritonitis. Anytime you see the suffix itis, it always means inflammation. So whether it's gingivitis, inflammation in your gums, or tendinitis, inflammation of a tendon, or bronchitis, encephalitis. Well, peritonitis is just acute inflammation of the peritoneum. And its cause can be caused by any type of infectious microbes, viral, bacterial, fungal. So that's peritonitis, which just is inflammation of the peritoneum. And different features of the oral cavity or the mouth. Let's see what we need here. All right, so the cheeks, you know what that is. The hard palate and the soft palate. Hard palate, soft palate. So if you use your finger, your tongue, and you kind of like felt the roof of your mouth, like just behind your incisors there, your front teeth. Well, this region right here to your tongue or your finger, if you use your finger, make sure you wash your hands first. That'll feel very hard. That's the hard palate. Now, if you move back, and I made this line a little wrong, and you get back in here, it's going to start feeling soft on the roof of your mouth, and that's the soft palate. And it also contains this little thing that looks like a little boxing bag, punching bag that hangs in the back of your throat. That's the uvula. So the uvula down here, part of the soft palate, lined with mucous membrane. Its function, so when you swallow, it and the soft palate move up and block the nasal cavity. So it blocks what's called the nasopharynx. So when you swallow, you don't want like water or food. You want it to go down into your esophagus. You do not want it to go up into your nasopharynx and then come out your nose, because that really won't help anything. You don't want liquids and foods coming out your nose. Obviously, everybody knows the tongue. Skeletal muscle organ, lined with mucous membranes, and its job, it moves food around. So when you're chewing it, it's nice to have your tongue there to push it towards the teeth so you can chew it. Also speech. Obviously, it's hard to, not digestive system, but it does allow you to talk. The moving around of your tongue allows you to form different sounds. Taste, because your tongue contains taste buds, and also it's the tongue that actually is very important in swallowing, because it's what's going to move what's called the bolus. Bolus is when you put something in your mouth, you start chewing it up, it gets mixed with saliva, and it becomes like a ball of moistened food. That's a bolus. And it's the tongue that's actually going to push that back into your oropharynx, so basically the top of your throat, to begin for preparing to swallow. Also, swallowing is called deglutition, but we'll go over that in a second. And it also contains papillae. And papillae are like the little bumps on your tongue. And some of the papillae contain taste buds. The taste buds are actually in between them, so it kind of gives them protection. But the papillae are just like the little ridges that makes your tongue kind of rough. So if you ever had your cat or your dog like lick your hand and it feels kind of like sandpaper, well, that's because of the little bumps on it called the papillae. And I don't think you're going to have to know any of this, so I'm not really going to say much. You can write it down if you want, but the muscle, it's attached to a bone called the hyoid bone, which is right there. You're not going to need to know this. The mandibles, your jawbone, but you will need to know this in the skeletal system, so what the heck. The hard palate, remember that's the roof of your mouth, and what's called the styloid process of the temporal bone, which is right there, but once again, highly doubt you'll need to know this. So, moving on. Salivary glands. Salivary glands, you can probably guess what they do. Salivary glands secrete saliva. And saliva is important because it helps to moisten the food, because it would be really hard to swallow, a hamburger if it goes down all dry. So it helps to moisten the food, and also saliva contains enzymes, which help to begin to break down the food even before it travels down the esophagus. So I think they actually found a fourth salivary gland. I can't remember what it's called, but we're just going to go with three. So the first one is called the parotid salivary gland. So you can see that's located right here. That's a gland that produces saliva. You have the submandibular salivary gland, and that's right down here. And last one, you have the sublingual, which is just below the tongue, and that's located right there. So those are your three, but I think I read somewhere there's four now. We'll look into that. So those are the three salivary glands that you'll need to know. Now, some of this you will need to know. So obviously, salivation, when you're salivating, that's when saliva is being secreted into your mouth. It's autonomic, so you can't think about it like, hey, saliva, start coming out. It's autonomic, happens all by itself. So obviously when food is in your mouth, or if you smell food, if you're thinking of food, if you see food, any of that thing can start salivation to occur. What's it made out of? Vast majority of it is made of just water, 99.5% water. I believe that should be 0.5%, not 0.05, because 99.5 plus 0.5 would be 100. But anyways, the other 0.5% contains enzymes like amylase, which breaks down starch into sugars. And there's also lingual lipase. Lipase breaks down lipids into their components, fatty acids and glycerol. Also contains mucus. That's what makes your saliva. If you spit, it's not like water. It doesn't have the consistency of water. It's a little stickier, and that's the mucus. And it also contains ions. So what's its function? Wet food. So it makes the food wet, makes it a lot easier to swallow something that's going to slide down than something that's dry and going to stick in your esophagus. Amylase, which I just said, begins to break down starch. So if you ever put a saltine cracker in your mouth, usually you chew it and then you swallow it. But if you leave it there for a while, saltine crackers are made of carbohydrates. So if you left it, it'll taste like a cracker at first, of course, and salty. But after a while, it'll start to taste sweet, because that cracker, the amylase in your saliva, breaks it down, turns the carbohydrates into sugars. So if you left it in your mouth long enough, I've never actually tried it, but that's why I hear. It dissolves food for tasting. So without saliva, it's harder to taste the food. So the saliva helps it, kind of turns it into a liquid, so it's able to be detected by the taste buds. It also contains lysozyme, which is an enzyme that helps to take care of bacteria in the mouth, destroy bacteria. And it protects the mouth because it's basically it's a rinsing action. So the saliva that you produce throughout the day, which is about 1 to 1.5 quarts, it helps to rinse out your mouth from the. Obviously it's better to actually rinse with mouthwash or water or whatever. But without that, The saliva does actually help to rinse out your mouth as you produce saliva throughout the day. And salivation, since it's autonomic, increased salivation is related to the parasympathetic nerves, the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. So sight, seeing food, smelling food, sounds, I guess somebody chewing on food or something, memory of food, the tongue, tasting the food, all these things can increase salivation. To stop salivation, which causes your mouth to be dry, that's when you're afraid. And that's the sympathetic nervous system. So if you ever found yourself taking a test or anything that's maybe going to go on a really scary ride and your mouth gets dry, well, that's because the sympathetic nervous system is kicking in, and that causes salivation to slow down or even stop. And now the anatomy or the structure of teeth. Teeth are what's called accessory digestive structures. The reason for that is because the food doesn't directly pass through your teeth. So same thing with your salivary glands. Food doesn't go through your salivary glands, but they do assist in digestion. So these are accessory structures because obviously the teeth are the first things that really begin to break down the large chunks of food and really break them down into smaller pieces. And this is the different parts of the tooth. So first you have the gingiva. Remember, gingivitis is inflammation of your gums. So here it is right here. Gingiva is just your gums. The periodontal ligament, which is right here. This right here, it's basically what connects the part of the tooth, this part called the cementum, and it connects it to the bone in your jaw, like either your mandible or your axilla. It's called alveolar bone right here. So the periodontal ligament is what connects the tooth to the bone. You have the crown right here. The crown, so that is the part of the tooth that you can actually see. So it's like above the gum lines. It's not located deep down below the gums. You know, if you ever had a tooth extracted or pulled out, you can see that there's a lot of tooth underneath that you can't see. But the crown is the top part that you can see. The roots, which is right here, that is the lower portion. It's made out of what's called dentin. Dentin is a hard calcified material that's made of mostly calcium. And between the crown and the root, you have the neck of the tooth. So that's just like the middle segment of the tooth. And at the center of the tooth, you have the pulp and what's called the pulp cavity. So that's in here. And you can see that's what contains the nerves. So this yellow thing right here, that's the nerves that allows you, if you have a toothache or whatever, that's because that nerve is being stimulated. And it also contains the blood vessels, which help to nourish the tooth. And more tooth structure, so dentin, which is all of this stuff, all in here. It's made out of connective tissue, but it's been calcified, so it's got a lot of calcium in it. The enamel is the tough very outer covering of your teeth. It's actually translucent, so you can see through it, but it looks white because of the dentin below it. And if you drink a lot of coffee like me, it can, or if you smoke cigarettes or any of that stuff, can be stained kind of yellow. So that's the enamel. Cementum. So you have cementum, very hard, kind of like bone-like substance, which connects to the periodontal ligament, which is right there. So you have the cementum, which is connected to the periodontal ligament, which then connects the tooth to the bone. And last, if you ever had a root canal, well, I've had a couple. So remember, the root is this bottom part, which is located, so this is where, right here is where it's entering the bone. So the neck is above the bone line, but kind of below the gums. So inside the root, there's a canal. There's like a space right here, and that's what allows that nerve to go in. That's a passageway for nerves and blood vessels to go in and out of the pulp cavity of the tooth. And different types of teeth. Maybe you've heard of deciduous trees. What's a deciduous trees? Deciduous trees are trees that their leaves fall off in the fall and in the winter. Well, deciduous teeth, those are the teeth that you're going to lose. Those are your baby teeth. So 20 teeth that start around 6 months, you won't need to know it. Just know that deciduous teeth are teeth that are eventually going to fall out. Those are the baby teeth that get replaced. And they get replaced by your permanent teeth. So you have 32 teeth. You get them between 6 and 12. They're numbered 1 to 16. On the bottom, it's 17 to 32. You won't need to know that. Types of teeth. So the teeth that are in the very front, like if you're going to bite an apple, the teeth that you're going to actually take the chunk of the apple, those kind of the flat teeth in the front, those are your incisors. Your cuspids, or also called your canines, those are kind of like the ones if you're a vampire or Dracula, or he has like real long canines. Well, those are your cuspids. So you have 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom. Your premolars, they have what's called 2 cusps. And cusps are just like if you rub your tongue on your teeth, you can feel that there's little ridges. Well, the premolars only have 2 ridges or cusps. And behind that, you have your molars, which have 3 or more cusps or little ridges. And both of those are for crushing and grinding the food, whereas your incisors and cuspids, your canines, those are for like tearing off pieces of food, like so eating, ripping off little pieces of corn on a corn on the cob, or biting an apple. So the incisors and cuspids are for biting off, and then your premolars and molars are for crushing the food to make it smaller. And a little image here to show you the different types of teeth. So remember, if you're biting into an apple, these right here will be your incisors. Also down here, these are your incisors. Here, these would be more pointy, so I'll put little points on them. Those are your canines or your cuspids. I'm gonna go down here because it's better. So these would be your premolars right here. So remember, those have like 2 cusps, and then 3 or more cusps. And remember, the cusp are those little like ridges, the ridges on these molars. So back here, 3 or more cusps. Those are going to be your molars. So those are your teeth. I don't know if you'll need to know that or not. Digestion in the mouth. Mechanical digestion. Well, the most important thing that happens in the mouth is what's called mastication, which is just a fancy word for chewing. So mastication is when you're chewing the food and breaking it from a big chunk of food and chopping it down into much smaller pieces. It's also getting mixed with saliva, which forms what's called the bolus. The bolus is just that ball of chewed, saliva-filled food that's in your mouth after you've been chewing something for a while. And inside the mouth, there's also chemical digestion. Salivary amylase. Amylase is an enzyme that always breaks down starch. There's also going to be a pancreatic amylase that's released by the pancreas that also breaks down starch in the small intestines. pH of 6.5 to 7, so it's pretty neutral or slightly acidic. When enzyme hit the pH 2.5, that's very acidic. Gastric juices in the stomach, hydrolysis ceases. That means, you won't need to know that, but basically it means once the enzyme, the salivary amylase, enters the stomach, the acid in the stomach destroys the enzyme and it can't break down starch anymore. And there's also lingual lipase. Lipase is always an enzyme that breaks down triglycerides, or lipids or fats, and it breaks them down into what they're made out of, which is fatty acids and glycerol. So lingual lipase is also secreted into the mouth to help in the digestion of fats. Salivary amylase secreted in the mouth, which helps to break down starch into sugars. And now the pharynx. So you have the pharynx and the larynx. The pharynx is basically your throat. So it's like when you swallow something, the very back of your throat, the very top before it goes into the esophagus, and then also going up towards your nose. It's that space that you would commonly call, if you're clearing your throat, like that's you clearing your pharynx. So it's a funnel-shaped tube made of skeletal muscle, mucous membranes, extends from the nasal cavity, so just behind your nose. So if you try to hawk up a loogie, that's you bringing down the contents of your nose through the nasopharynx, and then the oropharynx. The oropharynx is just directly behind your mouth, and then it'll eventually go to what I call the hypopharynx. It's also called the laryngopharynx, but I call it the hypopharynx. So its basic function in digestion is called deglutition, which once again is just a fancy word for swallowing. It's facilitated by saliva and mucus. That's what helps to moisten the food, makes it slippery, makes it a lot easier to swallow. And it starts when the bolus is pushed into the oropharynx. So that's the part of the pharynx that's directly, so if whenever you go, and a doctor's looking into your mouth, looking back directly through your mouth into the back of your throat, that's the oropharynx. If you go up or superior, that's going to be the nasopharynx. And then just below that, before you go into the esophagus, that's the what I call the hypopharynx, because it's a lot easier to say, and it's also called that as well. Sensory nerves send signal to deglutition center in the brainstem, so it's like the pons and the medulla, which this is pretty much autonomic when this happens, when the sensory nerves from the medulla and the pons, you won't need to know this. The soft palate, along with the uvula, remember that's the little punching bag that's in the back of your throat, it's lifted up, and that closes your nasopharynx. So when you swallow, the soft palate moves up and closes the nasopharynx so that liquid or food does not go up into the nose, but it ends up going down into the hypopharynx and then the esophagus. The larynx is lifted. Larynx is the voice box, so that has to do with the trachea. You don't want food going into your larynx. But remember that little flap called the epiglottis bends over and covers the larynx or the glottis. So that's what the epiglottis covers, the trachea. So it doesn't allow food and liquids to go down your trachea into your lungs, because that's not going to do any good. It covers that so the food goes into the esophagus and heads towards the stomach. And the esophagus, so you can see it right here. So here's the pharynx, base of your throat, and then the esophagus, the long food tube, which runs from the pharynx, goes through the diaphragm, and it's going to enter the stomach. Muscular tube, it's lined with what's called stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Stratified means, this is away from the summer assignment, if it was simple squamous tissue, then it would be just a single line of cells, and below that would be connective tissue. But stratified means it's like cells on top of cells on top of cells on top of cells. So it's a bunch of cells stacked on top of each other. That's what stratified means. Squamous cells, it's the same thing. Your skin cells are also squamous. They're kind of squashed down. So that's what it's made of. I doubt you'll need to know that. Where is it located? It's in front or anterior to the vertebra, posterior or behind the trachea, posterior behind the heart, and it pierces the diaphragm, what's called the hiatus. And you can have what's called hiatal hernia or diaphragmatic hernia. And that's basically where you're not going to need to know this, but it's where the stomach actually, a part of the stomach actually pushes through the diaphragm and moves up. And it can cause discomfort. Some people think it's a heart attack when they have a hiatal hernia. But you won't need to know that. And histology of the esophagus, what is the esophagus? What type of tissue is it made out of? Well, so remember, the esophagus is a tube. So the layer that's just the most deep or inside the tube that's directly on the opening of the tube, that's called the mucosa. And remember, it's made of stratified squamous cells. That's a bunch of cells stacked on top of each other. So this is like the inner lining of the esophagus. And then outside of that, you have what's called the submucosa. This is not made out of cells. That's made of connective tissue. It also contains the blood vessels. And that connective tissue also allows the mucosa, those cells that make up the mucosa, to move and to be able to kind of stretch as you're swallowing food. And then the most outer portion of the esophagus is called the muscularis region. And in this, you'll have to know this. This is kind of different from most of the digestive system. Most of the digestive system, the food moves through the digestive system all by itself because it's controlled by smooth muscles. Smooth muscles are not under voluntary control, so they move, they contract and relax all on their own. But in the esophagus, it's a little different because the upper 1/3 of the esophagus, the top part, is skeletal muscle. So that is muscle that is actually under voluntary control. The middle is mixed, both skeletal and smooth, and the lower 1/3 of the esophagus is all smooth muscle, so the lower part of the esophagus is totally involuntary, happens all by itself. And also inside the esophagus, you have two what's called sphincters. Sphincters, they're circular muscles, but they're kind of like valves, so they open and close, and there's both an upper and a lower esophageal sphincters, and those things, basically their job is they close. So when food goes into the stomach, they close so it doesn't allow the food that's being digested in the stomach to move back up into the esophagus, because that food in the stomach is highly acidic with hydrochloric acids. You would not want that moving back up into the esophagus, which would burn the esophagus, and it leads to things like GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disorder, or commonly called heartburn. All right, the physiology of deglutition. Deglutition, remember, that's just a fancy word for swallowing. So first you have what's called the voluntary stage. And basically that's just where the tongue is going to push back the bolus. Remember, bolus is just a fancy word for a chewed ball of saliva-filled food that's now ready to be swallowed. So the tongue is going to push that bolus back into the oropharynx, and then later to the laryngopharynx, or which I like to call the hypopharynx. Breathing is going to stop in what's called the pharyngeal stage. So once that bolus reaches your pharynx, breathing stops. So don't try to breathe in, swallow at the same time. Won't happen. Remember the soft palate and the uvula, which is right here. That's gonna move upward and shut down. So let me change my color so that food cannot move up into the nasopharynx and then maybe come out your nose. You don't want that. You want food to be going down. Vocal cords closed. Remember the epiglottis. So that's going to be right here. The epiglottis is going to shut, so then the food cannot go down the trachea, because you do not want to go down towards your lungs. You want it to be directed down the esophagus. And last, you have the esophageal stage. So that's where the food is now in the esophagus. And that food is going to be pushed along by wave-like muscle contractions called peristalsis. So I don't know if you've ever milked a cow or a goat or seen it done. But when you squeeze the hand to milk a cow, you don't just squeeze your fingers all at once. You squeeze like your index and then your, what's the longest one called? I forget. So your pointer finger, then the next one. So you move your fingers like in a wave-like motion, and that's what squeezes the milk out. I did it when I was a kid. So it's the same thing with your esophagus. It's rhythmic wave-like motions which actually push the food down your esophagus. So that's why people in space, where there's no gravity, or if you're standing on your head, don't try it, the food will still go down against the force of gravity, because it's those wave-like muscle contractions called peristalsis that actually forces the food down the esophagus and into the stomach. And more deglutition or swallowing. So remember, here's peristalsis again. That's the wave-like motion of the muscles contracting and relaxing to force the food, the bolus, down the esophagus. Now, the esophagus contains both circular and what's called longitudinal muscle fibers. And those guys kind of work together to push it down the esophagus. So the circular muscle fibers are they're arranged basically in a circle. So they go around the circumference of the esophagus, where the longitudinal fibers are arranged vertically. So those are arranged up and down, where the circular fibers are arranged horizontally around the esophagus. And you can see here the bolus, the chewed food, reaches the lower esophageal sphincter, and that's going to be right here. So that's like the boundary between the esophagus and the stomach. So that sphincter is like a valve that's obviously going to open when food is coming in, but then when food's not going in anymore, it's going to close and keep that food in the stomach and does not allow that bolus, that partially digested food, to go back into the esophagus. Travel time takes 4 to 8 seconds between swallowing and the food actually entering your stomach. That's longer than I heard, but we'll go with that. And for liquids, since it just flows through, it doesn't even really require the peristalsis. Liquid just flows through like a pipe. It gets there in about 1 second. And now some very common esophageal disorders that occur in the esophagus. One is called GERD or gastroesophageal reflux disorder. And that's where the lower esophageal sphincter, remember that circular band of muscle that acts like a valve, it opens and closes. It's supposed to open to allow food in, close to not let the food back out. Well, sometimes it'll fail to open. So if it fails to open, that's when it's like, man, I feel like there's a bunch of food still in my throat. And that happens occasionally. And eventually it will open and allow that food to come in. But if it opens and it's not supposed to, that can cause food to come back up into the esophagus. And since that food from the stomach is now filled with hydrochloric acid from the stomach, obviously that's going to burn and cause irritation to your esophagus. And it can feel like chest pain, or even some people think they're having a heart attack if it's a severe case. And also everybody's heard of heartburn. That's basically the same thing, where those gastric juices, those gastric contents, gastric just means stomach, so those reflux back into the esophagus, and since they're filled with acid, your stomach, the epithelial cells that line your stomach are not designed to withstand acid, but the cells in your stomach are, because they secrete a special type of mucus that protects them from the acid. All right, folks, I hope you understood most of this, and I hope you kind of enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.